So, would you like to introduce yourself? First of all, greetings from Dhaka, Bangladesh. This is a dream come true after 17 years of teaching about microcredit and how much it had an impact here. It's great to finally be here. Would you like to introduce yourself to whoever's
Sure.
watching?
I'm happy to do so. I'm Saleemul Huq. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University Bangladesh in Dhaka, where we are now sitting in my office.
And I was warned that you're very humble, that you will probably not point out that you were talking about climate adaptation before climate adaptation was a term, that you play a key role in convincing the United Nations framework on climate change to acknowledge that we need adaptation, and now that we need reparations of some kind, loss and damage. This is true, you're nodding.
Well, I was one of the people that did it. I don't claim sole responsibility, but yes, I was there at the very beginning.
So I think this is how your life experience might relate to the themes of my book. The stories in my book are human stories of people who started with challenges or worked through challenges, had a vision of an innovation, and made it happen in reality despite challenges. Could you describe, in your own way, you've been an entrepreneurial leader. You were one of the people who realized that it's too late to avoid changes. They're happening. We've seen some of them here. And that we need to start basically adapting human activity to the new reality. What have you learned? What are the most important lessons that you think could be adopted by somebody in any career, whether they're starting a business, a charity, or trying to be an entrepreneur in the framework of 193 UN members? First of all, do you agree with the comparison? Are you an entrepreneurial leader?
Yes, I'll agree with that.
Okay.
In my own way.
Right. Assembling resources to solve a problem. So what are the lessons that you would offer from your life experience? The number one lesson from these climate negotiations, what lesson do you think there is for a business person?
Well, I think the number one lesson, and it's even more than a lesson, it's a warning to everybody who are living on the planet right now, that we have entered the world of a brand new world of climate change impacts. They are already happening. They will continue to happen. They will continue to get worse during our lifetimes. We might be able to prevent them getting really bad in the longer term, but for the next decade or so, we are locked into things getting a lot worse. And when I say worse, just for comparison, if you think the COVID pandemic was bad, if you think the Ukraine-Russia war is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's going to get a lot worse than both of them combined. And we are not ready. Countries are not ready, whether they're rich countries or poor countries, and people are not ready, and businesses are not ready. So this is a warning to everybody to be aware of the problem from your perspective, wherever you happen to live or whatever you happen to do, and find out ways on how you can prepare yourself to tackle the problem. Now, in that context, my country, Bangladesh, where I'm now speaking from, happens to be one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. It has known that for the last 10 years, and we have not been sitting idle. We have been trying to figure out how to cope with the impacts when they happen, and we have become, in many ways, the leading global adaptation capital of the world. We are adapting as we speak right now to the impacts of climate change. In fact, just 2 days ago, we got hit by a cyclone, Citran, in the coastal zone of Bangladesh. The deaths are in the dozen or so already reported. There may be more. But those are very, very few deaths compared to the deaths that we used to have in the past, which would be in the tens of thousands, sometimes even hundreds of thousands. That doesn't happen anymore. We are now one of the most cyclone prepared countries in the world. We can give warnings to everybody. Everybody knows what to do. There are shelters within a few hours walking distance that they can go to take shelter, and people don't die anymore. In fact, the deaths that we have reported are mostly fishermen out at sea who don't make it back to land in time. But anybody on land, almost all of them manage to survive, and that's a huge way forward. In fact, even in rich countries like the United States, they just got hit by Hurricane Ian in Florida, and the death toll is over 60 people in the United States of America. Okay. And so Bangladesh is way ahead of other countries in that one metric. cyclone preparedness. The cyclones still do a lot of damage, and we have to deal with that, and that's what we call loss and damage from climate change. But loss of lives, we have been able to prevent to a very, very large extent.
So that was a great warning. I asked for advice for business people, and it's actually, I'm glad that you didn't quite answer the question as it was asked, but that is probably the most important piece of advice for anybody that intends to be alive from here forward, that you're not on the planet that you think you are on. That's one of the great lines that summarizes it. Now, what have you learned, though, in the process of negotiation? Well, actually, let's build on your first point. Would you say then that if you are an entrepreneur, whether in a charity or a business, whether you know it or not, your number one background threat to what you're doing is climate? It will touch almost every industry. That you have to take it in, it'll disrupt supply chains. Even if you don't deal with climate issues, it will somehow disrupt your business.
Absolutely. I think there's no way to avoid being impacted by climate change, even if you feel you're not going to.
Yeah.
And this is now true even if you're living in a rich country. It used to be true for us living in poor countries. We've known this for a long time, but it's also now true for people living in rich countries. In Europe, they just had a major heat wave that caused actually quite a lot of large excess deaths as well, and things that they had not expected to happen for another 30 or 40 years. They happened right now, this year, 2022. And so everybody is having to learn about the impacts of climate change the hard way, which is being hit by something, either a heat wave or a hurricane or wildfire or a flood, and they're happening everywhere, and we're not ready for them. So you need to be aware of that. And then there are second order repercussions. It may not hit you directly, but if you have a business that depends on supply chains of giving you materials that are coming from places that are hit, then you are going to be affected. Your business is going to be affected. In fact, a number of large-scale floods that have occurred have disrupted businesses in other continents. You know, when Bangkok had floods in Thailand a few years ago, the car business in Japan came to an end because the parts used to come from Thailand, and they stopped coming, and Toyota couldn't make their cars in Japan. And so we live in a globalized world with particularly supply chains going across the world. And in now, we are all at risk of our businesses being affected by those supply chains. Now, we could do one of two things. We could say, all right, we just won't do business in those vulnerable places. I think that's a very short-sighted view. The other one is, let's do business in the vulnerable places, but be ready. Help our suppliers to be able to cope with the impacts when they happen, and therefore be more resilient to those impacts that when they happen, which builds their resilience and also our own resilience.
Okay, so now let's get back to the question that the first question as it was asked. What do you wish you knew when you were 25 years old? Let's reframe it that way. You've spent a lifetime in these climate negotiations where you have 192 other countries, some of them led by leaders that sometimes don't even believe in climate change. You must have learned a lot about how to convince people of a fact, how to convince them of your opinion, and how to get them to commit to something. So I'm trying to figure out how to get these secrets out of your head. If you were talking to a 25-year-old version of yourself, what would you tell yourself? What would you shake your young self and say, be ready, you're going to make this mistake, here's the lesson that you need to know, you're going to be so much better? What would you tell your younger version of yourself?
So what I would tell my younger version of myself is what I tell young people today, including my son, is don't depend on your leaders to do the right thing. The history of the UN Framework Convention is we did a lot of agreements, but we didn't do the follow-up that we agreed to do. We didn't actually implement decisions that we made to do things. And we left it to the leaders to do it, and they didn't do it. And so we cannot leave it to them. We need to be the ones taking action, and by we, I mean every citizen on planet Earth. We need to be thinking of ourselves as citizens of planet Earth first, now, in the context of climate change, and our national citizenship is second-order citizenship. It doesn't really matter as much as being a citizen of planet Earth, and working together to deal with global problems. This is a planetary scale problem, going to hit everybody on planet Earth. We need to take individual responsibility to do what we can where we are, but then link up with others who are doing similar things around the world and work together, and not depend on our leaders to come together once a year in the COP and do the right thing. They say the right thing, but then they don't go and do the right thing that they said they do. So let's give up on that.
That's interesting coming from somebody who has been to every COP. What is the value then? People are going to be writing the usual things, especially on social media in a few days or a few weeks. They're going to be, oh, what a waste of time. Oh, we're all going to die. What is the value of engaging?
So there are two values of engaging, and I am one of the few people who's been to every single one of the 26 conferences or parties that have been held. But I make the point that I go to these events, which are 2-week long events every year, for 2 weeks in the year. I don't spend all my time in negotiations. 2 weeks out of 52 weeks, I go there and I participate. The other 50, I work on the ground on the reality of climate change and helping people adapt to it and prepare to adapt to it in reality on the ground, which is far more important. But in the negotiations, it's still important for us to go for several reasons. The first reason, particularly for poor and vulnerable countries like mine, Bangladesh, it's actually the only forum where we have a seat at the table to say something. The UN Security Council doesn't have us on it. The G7 doesn't have us on it. The G20 doesn't have us on it. Any big gathering of the big countries don't invite us. We don't get invited. The only place we have a seat at the table is the United Nations Framework Convention. Once a year, we get to go there, we get to say our piece, and we try and convince other people to listen to us and agree with what we want. Most of the time we lose the argument, but at least we get to make the argument. Okay. Sometimes, if we play our cards right, we can actually win the argument. And I'll give one example. Shall I give the example?
Yes, let's give the example. And again, I want to repeat this question. What the biggest lesson learned? How did you get this accomplishment done? I really want you to maybe say something that hasn't already been published about how do you make it happen when there is a breakthrough?
So I'll give the example of the breakthrough that took place 7 years ago in Paris at the 21st Conference of Parties. We achieved what we call the Paris Agreement, which is by far the pinnacle of the process. We agreed what to do. We agreed to keep global temperature below 1.5 degrees. The rich countries agreed to provide $100 billion a year to the poor countries to tackle climate change through mitigation and adaptation. Neither of which we are on track to do, but nevertheless, the agreements are in place. But the achievement that we had was that going into Paris, the developed countries and also the big developing countries like China and India did not want to change the global goal, temperature goal, from 2 degrees, which it was at that time, to 1.5 degrees. Now, it may sound trivial, but the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is millions of people, poorest people on our planet, not being protected. At 2 degrees, we help and we protect almost everybody, but not everybody. We do not protect the poorest, and we're talking a few 100 million poorest people on the planet living on small islands in the Pacific, in the coastal zone of Bangladesh. And by adopting the 2-degree target, we are in effect telling them, we're not going to save you. We're going to save ourselves, but you are off. You are not going to be saved. And we, the vulnerable developing countries, managed over 2 weeks to make diplomatic moves, get evidence, and get buy-in by different constituencies, particularly civil society and media, to convince the leaders of the other countries who initially were against it to actually agree to change the global goal from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. Now, again, we are not on track to meet it yet, and it's still an elusive goal, but nevertheless, we got everybody to agree to that goal, even though they didn't want to. And the United States was one of the most reluctant to do it, but they eventually did.
Maybe that was the secret sauce. Maybe that was the secret that we were looking for. You just mentioned that you built a coalition. You didn't go and argue purely to the powerful representatives. You went to civil society and the media. So is that the winning strategy? Is that what it all comes down to? And your advice for people in other fields of life would be build relationships, even with people outside of your industry, because you don't know whether it's somebody in media or civil society. You simply don't know the value of a relationship later to building an argument or convincing people or to build a movement or to to make an innovation a reality. Is that your major
Absolutely.
point? It's all about relationships?
Absolutely. Relationships, and I'll give you a little bit of a slightly more theoretical framing of it. I deal in what I call building social capital.
Okay.
Right? And essentially the simple way to describe social capital is friendships, alliances, people, like-minded people like yourself.
Okay.
Finding ways to think together, plan together, and then work together and join forces to make it happen. And I believe that that's actually much more important, and strategically we can leverage that into effective action that will be able to effectively compete against the rich who have money, finance capital, and the powerful who have political capital. We don't, but we can convert our social capital into a countervailing force against both the politicians and the billionaires.
How did you build well, I think we already answered it, how you built some of the relationships. You show up for all 2 weeks of every conference of parties every year. Other secrets of how you build relationships. Before, people used to come to you like I did when you were starting out and you were less known. How did you build these relationships?
Well, I built them up from the bottom up. So, people I knew, we would get together at the COPs. Just to give you one example, when I started going to the COPs, the major way that people thought of dealing with the climate change problem was what we call mitigation. So the problem was perceived as emissions of greenhouse gases, and hence the solution is we stop emitting or reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, which we call mitigation, which is absolutely correct. But then over time, we saw that we were not mitigating enough, and climate change impacts were becoming inevitable, not happening, but will be inevitable now.
And now they're happening.
And now they're happening. We've crossed the third threshold. But the first threshold was we needed to adapt. And when I started talking about adaptation, in fact, I used to get told by people doing mitigation, saying, don't talk about adaptation because they won't do mitigation. And I said, well, they're not doing enough mitigation now. They're going to have to talk about adaptation whether they like it or not. And we started a very small group of us talking about adaptation. I used to run a one-day event at the COPs called Adaptation Day, where I'd invite a few people, friends who'd come. We'd be a few adaptation people in a sea of mitigation people. We'd get together, we'd join forces, we'd combine and invite others to come.
You were a startup,
Exactly, a social startup.
Okay.
And we've been running it since then. We do a 2-day event in the middle of the week, the Saturday and the Sunday. The COP is a 2-week event.
May I invite myself to your?
You're most welcome to come over the next time. And it has grown. It has grown a whole community of practice who are both scientists, practitioners, and now funders and national governments as well, because it's becoming self-evident. We no longer have to argue this case for adaptation.
That was going to be my big question: is who would you invite? Because I've been to a COP, and it seems like almost like a carnival of different people from NGOs, academics. How did you decide who to invite? Did you ever turn away people? Some people say be selective about your network, or did you take a big tent approach and simply invited everybody?
Well, we take a big tent approach in terms of if you're interested, do come.
Okay.
On the other hand, in the conversations, if you are not aligned with what we want to do, then you obviously won't come along with what we decide to do.
Okay.
So the people who agree to take action, we form a coalition. Coalition of the willing, and we then build that coalition and add more people who are willing to join that. And that's really what we've been doing. It's a movement building exercise, really.
Okay. Let's small detour, because there's some questions that come up repeatedly in conversations, especially as I go to different parts of the world where large families were the norm. Congratulations to Bangladesh, by the way. I understand that family planning has really succeeded the campaign here. Average family size is closer to 2 per kids per family, which is amazing. But now a few big questions that I've never heard asked in an interview like this. You have a son. Is your advice to people, do you agree with the people who say, you know what, I'm just not going to have kids? What kind of a world would I might bring them into? It is a force multiplier. Where are your sympathies with people who are completely sworn against ever having kids? The people who say, no, enough people are at zero, enough countries are at zero population, we should have kids. Are you a fan of 1 or 2? Do you have an opinion? Because some people have strong opinions, but they're scared to say them.
Sure. So let me answer your question first by mentioning a little bit of the current situation in Bangladesh
Yeah,
in a
please.
historical perspective.
Please, because I was just in countries in Africa in the middle of the summer, and some people laughed at me for not having any kids. They were very proud of having 13, and then I know other people who are like, one kid is too much.
Yeah.
So please tell us Bangladesh's example.
So, Bangladesh used to be 50 years ago. We're now celebrating 50 years as an independent country.
Right.
But before we became an independent country, we were half of Pakistan. We were the eastern half of Pakistan, and what is now Pakistan was the western half.
Yes.
And we then fought a war with them.
1971.
71, War of Independence, and then we became an independent country.
Quick interjection, because I've heard such drastically different estimates of the total death toll of that revolution. What's the number or the range that you think is accurate?
Well, we talk about several million
Okay.
deaths, definitely.
Okay.
Anything from 1 to 3 million. It could be
Okay.
a range.
Okay.
But certainly at least a million.
And a
Possibly
lot of
up to 3 million.
civilians.
Mostly civilians.
From what? Starvation?
No, being shot by the army.
It's a lot of bullets. I mean, some of the
Yeah.
millions of bullets
Yeah.
expended. I'm sorry to ask, but in the conversations, people have been, we've had conversations about history, and that's one of the ones that people are most confused about what really happened. So sorry for that interjection. But okay, so you're celebrating 50 years. The country was also born right after the revolution was a massive cyclone that claimed
That's right. Exactly.
hundreds of thousands,
Exactly.
300,000 people
Exactly.
died.
Exactly.
So with that as history, this used to be one country with Pakistan after the British left South
Yeah.
Asia. What next? What happened with the birth rate? It was very high?
So the birth rate in both parts of the country was relatively high,
Okay.
all right, around 3%.
Okay.
3%
population
going up
growth every
yes,
year.
Every year. And one of our bones of contention with our Western counterparts was that they ruled us when we had the majority of the population.
Okay.
So we had a bigger population than them, but they were ruling us, and their army was here, and so on. And eventually we fought them and we liberated ourselves. But since then, we're now talking 50 years, the birth rate in Pakistan has continued at 3%. And the population in Pakistan is around 210 million people.
Yeah.
In Bangladesh, the birth rate went from 3 down to 2. And it's a combination of primarily girls' education, family planning, helping the Muslim clergy be supportive and not against family planning. And a combination of all of these has led to a drastic decrease in birth rates, so that we now have 170 million people. And Pakistan has 210. 40 million more babies were born in Pakistan. 40 million less babies were born in Bangladesh, voluntarily. No sterilization, no forcing. Mothers, wives, husbands deciding that they would have less children. And 2 per family is now a very typical family.
Okay.
In terms of whether we should have children, I don't think we should have no children at all. I mean, giving birth and having children is part of the human experience. But we should certainly be careful about not exposing ourselves to too much hassle and problems, and be able to look after the ones that we have, whether we have 1, 2, or even more than that. And the anxiety that comes from not wanting to have children, in my view, is not necessarily protecting your child from what's going to happen. You're better off having the child and then helping to protect the whole world, including the world's children, and not just your own child.
It's almost like being more invested in the future than you are otherwise.
Precisely.
Interesting point. Okay.
And being globally invested. You see, one of my key points that I try to make everywhere is that we have crossed a threshold where just being a citizen of my own planet and doing my own thing is no longer a viable option. We might think it is, but it is.
Being a citizen of your own country is
Yes,
not enough.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you need to think as a global citizen, and kids across the world are your kids as much as your own kids. And how do you help them work together and mobilize together? And incidentally, they are. Every Friday, the millions of kids all over the world come out of school and they demonstrate.
The strike for
It's the Fridays for Future movement. They're following the example of the Swedish teenager Greta Thunberg, who did it by herself. She went in with a little homemade placard and sat in front of the Stockholm Parliament in
Yeah.
Stockholm, all by herself every Friday,
Yeah.
not going to school, and saying, I'm not going to school.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to demonstrate. And that's spread like crazy. Millions of kids all over the world every Friday are organized. They are now doing it in an organized way. And to me, that is where the future lies, not the cops. The leaders will come to the cops and talk and not do. But the kids will actually do. And they'll make their leaders do.
Okay, so let's. God, there's so many questions I want to ask you. Maybe we should do rapid fire and then let's get to the core questions. As long as I have you here in front of me, you're not. You do believe that we are headed towards some amount of catastrophe, but I don't get the energy from you. You're a smiling, happy man. Are you an optimist? Is society going to get through? Are even countries like Bangladesh that are so vulnerable? Are you generally an optimist?
I am such an optimist that I think Bangladesh will be the most resilient country. All right.
Okay.
So over the last decade or more, as we became conscious of climate change and Bangladesh became conscious of climate change, we realized we were one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate
Because of flooding,
because of flooding,
the salt water getting into the
intrusion, sea
groundwater.
level rise, cyclones,
Right.
all the different kinds of impacts that climate will bring,
Yep.
they'll happen somewhere in Bangladesh.
Yes.
We tick
Even,
off all
even
of them.
this desertification.
Even droughts. Okay, so
Even
we don't
droughts.
have deserts, but
Right.
we do have
Right.
dry seasons
Yes.
where we can't grow a crop.
And they
Normally we grow 3 crops a year, but in parts of our country we can only grow 1, and then for 2 more seasons we can't grow anything.
Okay, so-
we call that a drought. In Africa or in Central Asia, they wouldn't call that a drought, but for us it is a drought. And so we have drought-prone areas, we have sea level rise, we have flooding, we have different kinds of flooding from the river, from in the cities,
Yeah.
coastal, and then we have cyclones periodically. We just had one a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
So all of the impacts of climate change, except glacial outbursts of lakes and the glaciers.
Right.
But we do have glaciers watering our rivers.
Exactly. So you
So
actually
they do
might,
affect us.
You might have a surge.
Precisely.
Right.
But not immediately. The water will take some time to come to us. But more or less, everything that climate change will do anywhere in the world, in our country, it's going to happen somewhere. And we realized that quite a long time ago, well over a decade
So
ago.
you're actually such an optimist that you are going to be a role model.
Exactly.
You think, for the
We
world.
we have been planning.
You're at the
We are the vanguard. We
Yeah.
prepared a national climate change strategy
Yeah.
before anybody in the world did. We then decided we need to invest in it ourselves. We can't wait for other people to come to our rescue.
And can I
we've done
interject
that.
here again to make the connection to being an entrepreneur and having a startup? When you were agitating for this, it was kind of like a startup. It doesn't exist, this
Exactly.
campaign. So, and apparently both political parties have supported.
Absolutely.
Now, pay attention now. For my countrymen in both countries where I have citizenship, Poland and the United States, and plenty of other countries, are so divided, it's almost impossible to imagine two parties agreeing on anything. So what did you do to build a coalition where both parties, regardless of who wins the next election, are completely unified on this issue? How did you do that?
Well, I wouldn't claim credit for that.
Okay.
I would say that's a feature of the problem. It's a global problem in which everybody in Bangladesh, whichever party they belong to, realize this isn't our fault.
And none of them saw a potential political divide exploiting the ignorance or the misinformation. Really, both sides actually accepted the facts.
Yes, I mean because we are a victim of the impacts of climate change.
And the facts were so big
They
that
were
they
so
could
big,
not
and
be
so
ignored.
being victims, there's no point in fighting between ourselves. We have the same. When
You have
we
a
go to
common
the
enemy.
we have a common enemy, exactly.
Right.
So so historically, over the period of the conferences of parties, the UNFCCC,
Yeah.
it hasn't mattered which party was in power from Bangladesh.
Right.
We made the same arguments.
Yeah.
Whether it was the BNP or the Awami League or Jatiyo Party, we've had 3 different parties ruling us.
Yeah.
But they've not changed their tune. The global tune has been the
Okay.
same. It's a consistent tune. We are the victims. You need to help us. We are doing what we can. And we need support to do that. But we are going to do it ourselves. And we are well on the way to transforming our own story from one of vulnerability to one of resilience.
One more detour question, but I'm going to this time save it for later and get back to the main theme, which is lessons that we can learn from you, the idea of climate adaptation, the movement as the equivalent of a startup. What were your biggest mistakes?
I guess the biggest mistakes were thinking that we knew things that we didn't know. Right? It's a new problem. And it started manifesting itself in different places in different ways. And we assumed in many times that we knew what the problem was and what to do about it, but it turned out we didn't, and it didn't work. So, in essence, as a science, adaptation to climate change is effectively a learning by doing science. You have to do and see whether what you're doing works or doesn't work. If it works, good, keep on doing it or do more of it. If it doesn't work, either stop doing it or learn a way to get doing it better and improve. And unfortunately, the way the global knowledge system is wired, it is hardwired with the developed countries know what to do, and we, the developing countries, don't. And they will come and tell us what to do. So we get international scientists and consultants coming in. We call them fly-in, fly-out experts coming to tell us what to do.
Okay.
Now, in many cases, that may be legitimate. They may actually know more than us.
Okay.
But when it comes to adapting to climate change, they don't. All right? The local people who are adapting themselves as we speak, without even knowing the word adaptation, are actually doing it, practicing it, and know much more than we, the experts, do how to do it. And so the branch of adaptation science that my center does, and Bangladeshis generally we're working on, is what we call locally led adaptation. Learning from the vulnerable people how to adapt and seeing how we, the outsiders, can assist them to do it more effectively rather than coming in and telling them what to do, which is still how the global adaptation funding is hardwired. So international funds come with international experts telling us, Bangladesh, look at our maps, look at our models. This is what's going to happen unless you do this, and here's some money to do this. And we say, well, we don't think that's going to work. They say, well, do it anyway. And so we do it anyway, and it doesn't work.
Well, so could you give some concrete examples? Because this is very interesting. I apologize on behalf of everybody that does that. That they don't see the silliness of it. What's an example of an adaptation that they urged that failed, and what is an example of an authentically locally sourced adaptation? Some of the things that I've seen over the last roughly 9 days here, and I came to learn, not to teach, was the rainwater harvesting, because you can't use the groundwater anymore. Building the shelters that have been built over many years now, that are up on legs, so the flood water can come through the ground floor, but people can take shelter on the top. There was an adaptation of that when people realized that they're reluctant to leave their belongings and their animals. So the idea of these smaller shelters that serve a smaller group of families came up. So we've seen that. Those are things that I have video of and I can share. What are some local adaptations that were locally sourced that are better than what the fly-in, fly-out experts? Can you give us some examples?
So let me give you a very classic example, which has a long history that predates climate change, but is also relevant in the context of climate change, which is what to do about rivers that flood, right? Including, your big rivers like the Mississippi and Missouri in the U.S.
And the mistake that they built dikes and
exactly. Right. You see, so there used to be a very, very strong tradition of engineer the hell out of them. Put embankments, make the river water flow through, and it won't flood anymore, and you protect everybody from flood.
So many unforeseen bad effects from that, right? Yeah.
And over last century, we've realized that's the wrong thing to do. Working with nature is what we should do. And in Bangladesh's case, we brought the example from the Netherlands. All right, so Netherlands are the world leaders in embanking. Hundreds of years of history good history of embankments working. But the Netherlands is a tiny little place compared to Bangladesh and the rivers, the Brahmaputra.
700 rivers you have flowing through your country.
Exactly. Yeah. So that model, which we did put in place in Bangladesh over the last 50 years, did not last. It wasn't built for purpose. It doesn't. And now we're reverting to living with nature, letting some flooding occur, protecting some places where we have high industries or populations, so the cities, but the agricultural land doesn't need to be protected. Let it flood. And then we use fisheries. We have open water fisheries. People fish. And that is actually a traditional adaptation to this pattern in Bangladesh. We have heavy monsoons during the rainy season. We have a dry season when we grow a crop of rice, and then before the monsoon starts, we harvest the rice, and then the monsoon comes and everything is underwater. Every household has a boat and a fishing net. They just go out and catch fish, and they have rice stored in their house. This is the traditional adaptation that we've had, but we destroyed it by putting embankments, and the fishermen have been disempowered and no longer able to fish.
Is this
so now we're trying to go back. We're now going back to nature.
Can we go back? Are people willing to go back to that?
We have to go back.
Yeah.
There's no question that we have. But it's not going back to the way things were 100 years ago. It's going back with a better understanding of the role nature can play and the role interventions can play, and being clever about that. What the jargon word we now use is nature-based solutions, not against nature solutions, but nature. Working with nature, making interventions, but making them in a clever way that takes nature into account and doesn't destroy nature or attack nature, which we've done too much of.
Should we go back to big themes? You mentioned as an entrepreneurial leader, the biggest mistake was assuming that you know things that you actually don't. What was, and the biggest breakthrough I think you mentioned was Paris. When you look to the future, you're probably going to say that loss and damages is the big theme that you want to work on. For anybody that watches this, what's the next thing, the next big victory that could you explain it in simple terms for anybody who watches this, and how are you going to get it done?
Sure. So
when are you going to get it done?
Yeah. So let me explain the history of the climate change issue over the last 3 decades as having what I call 3 eras. Okay. The first era, for the first decade or more, which is still continuing, is what we call mitigation, which is reduced emissions of greenhouse gases that cause the problem. We still need to do that. We're not doing enough of it. But then, about 2 decades ago, turn of the century, 2001, the precise turning point came with the 3rd assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that told us that impacts are going to happen. And we're going to have to adapt to them whether we like it or not. So adaptation as a strategy. So the problem morphed from emissions that need to be reduced to prepare for impacts that are now inevitable, unavoidable. Not now, but in 10 years' time. And so we had adaptation come through as the next wave of solutions that we need to think of. Now, there is a nuance to the adaptation, which is that the people that need to adapt on the planet are the poorest people on the planet first, because they're going to get hit first. Eventually, even the rich will get hit. But the poor are the ones that need to be helped first. And so you had a dual strategy of adaptation, but finding the poorest people on the planet and helping them to adapt, prioritizing them. Right? And so it coincided with what was until then a development agenda, development assistance for poor countries, which is a tradition that we have for a long, long time. It added to climate change. Not only just the poor and we have to help them, they're also vulnerable to climate change and we have to help them adapt. So also out of poverty and adaptation at the same time. So we had a joint agenda going forward. We are now on the threshold of crossing, and I would argue we have actually crossed in this year, 2022, into what I call the 3rd era, which is impacts already happening, leading to losses and damages. And we now live in the era of loss and damage from climate change, attributable to climate change. Just to take the Hurricane Ian that hit Florida recently, Florida gets hit by hurricanes all the time. You have a long history of that, and you're all ready for it. But Ian was very bad in 2 senses. Firstly, it was a category 5, it hit you with wind speed, and then it stayed and rained like hell over Florida for a while, and many of the people who lost their homes lost it from the flooding, not the wind speed. And I read in the order of 1 million people have lost their homestead, and they're actually the uninsured homes, the poorer homes. All right. So it's not the people who are rich and insured. So even in a rich country, the people who get hit are the poor people of that country. All right. And this is a very good example in Florida. So poor people are going to be the ones worst affected.
Yeah.
And so in the loss and damage framing, this reframing of the problem, it's a problem created by emissions of rich people,
Yep.
rich people in Bangladesh, like me, I'm a rich Bangladeshi,
Okay.
but rich people in rich countries like yourself, of which there are many, many more. All of us rich people, we have caused the problem. And we are putting the victims as the poorest people on the planet, whether they be poor people in Bangladesh or poor people in Florida. Many more poor people in Bangladesh than there are in Florida, but there's still poor people in Florida.
Yes.
Right? Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is a very good example. You know, Katrina came and hit in New Orleans. All the rich people evacuated. People in the Ninth Ward, black people, didn't. They were left to die. All right, more than 1,000 people in the richest country in the world died.
Yeah.
And that really is totally unacceptable in my view. That is
It's an
a
embarrassment.
failure of civilization.
It's a tragedy. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we don't want that to happen at a global scale.
Right.
We all need to be taking moral responsibility as polluters, those
Yeah.
of us who have a carbon footprint.
Really glad to bring this up. Quick interjection. This is the sort of detour question, like the one on kids that I was dying to ask you. Look, you said relationships are important. You said learning from across the world what's going on locally and getting an authentic feel for what's going on, feeling like every child out there is in a way your child. I don't regret. I've learned so much being on the ground here. There's things that I would not have learned out of a book, knowing what the quality of life is, spending time on the ground. And yet, I imagine that some people who watch me, who know me, say, "You hypocrite." They don't know this is my one sin, is buying plane tickets, that I don't rarely buy clothes, eat cheaply, live cheaply, don't consume. But what are your opinions on flying? Would your advice to people who watch this be like those people who swear off flying, not only swearing off meat because meat has such a big climate impact, but go beyond consuming less of everything and completely quit flying? Are you willing to take a no flying pledge?
No.
Okay.
I try to reduce my flying, but I do realize that it is a big carbon footprint.
Right. So how can we justify it
So-
to people who criticize?
So what I would say is that at an individual level, you should certainly do what you can.
Okay.
But wearing a hair chest, hair
That's
shirt
right. Yeah. To
is
torture
not
yourself.
helping anybody. All right. If you
Okay.
need to do a flight to do something good, then that's absolutely justified.
Okay.
The purpose, if you're going on a holiday, 2,000 miles away instead of taking a car
Regional.
ride somewhere
Yeah.
nearby, that is a sin. That is something, you have to be cognizant of the why you're doing something.
Yes.
And then justify why you're doing it and feeling morally justified that
Okay.
it is something that is worth doing.
Do
That's
I-
how I justify my air traveling.
Do I have your forgiveness or blessing then when I go to places to collect stories to then share, whether it's in the classroom, video, a book, article? I have your forgiveness.
You have, I tell you what you have, and it's a function of what you're doing,
Right.
which is that I put 3 levels to what actions people need to take once they realize that they are a polluter,
Yeah.
accept responsibility. I am a polluter, I know that. Then what should I do?
Right.
So I should reduce my carbon footprint.
Right.
Eat less meat, travel less,
Right.
do whatever I can, knowing that I can't bring it to zero, but I can reduce it.
Yeah.
That's number 1.
Right.
Number 2, not just sit idle, but organize. Work with others. Find other people who are doing something in my neighborhood, in my family, in my organization, in whatever sphere of action that I am in, who are trying to do something about this issue. And find a like-minded group and join forces with them. So we do things. You actually do something collectively, collective action.
Okay.
Locally with your people that you can,
Yeah.
and then you build on that to take it to a higher level. And there are 2 dimensions of that. The first dimension is a higher level in your own political system. So in your case, vote Trump out. You did that. All right? You voted him in the first place. That was a big no-no. But you then voted him out. And
I'm biting my tongue because I know I have students who are from all over the spectrum. Let's just say that, pray continue.
So basically you have to become political
Okay.
to get your political leaders to do the right thing. All right.
Pardon me, when I asked the person who connected us, what are some of the secrets of your success and why certain other heroes of Bangladesh have their time and sometimes pass out of fashion. And he said that some of you are religiously apolitical, that you are above politics, that you stay out of the political party fights. How do you reconcile? You say in the United States you have to take sides because one side is very clearly...
Absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so the United
So
States is a different context.
I'm not apolitical in the sense of, in the Bangladesh context, for example. I'm apolitical here.
Right.
You know, whoever is in charge of the government, I work with them and try and get them to do the right thing.
But in the United States, you would function
But
differently.
if you look at it globally, then there are certain countries. The United States is a stark example
Yes.
of a country that went the wrong way,
And a political party that...
and a political party that is still going in the wrong way.
Yeah.
It's not the only one, by the way. There are other countries. Australia was until recently similar to US under Trump, but after the new election and the new government, it's changed. Biden has changed America. So politics and elections matter
Yes.
in what kind of governments you end up with.
Yes, they do.
And my analysis and my lens for looking at the governments is what are they doing on climate change, all right?
Yeah.
They may be good or bad for your country, that's a different thing.
Yeah.
But as far as climate change is concerned, that's a global problem. The US is a global player. Can it be a good player or a bad player? We want it to be a good player,
Right.
all right? And so we look to you to elect a good government that delivers us a good player at the global level, right? And so there's national politics and then there's global cohesion as well. And that's where I now spend most of my time in building these networks of coalitions of what I call social capital. All right? Academics like you and me,
Right.
we all come together, find ways to join forces and engage with each other. And I'll give you an example of something that I do. I run every year a major. It started off as a national conference here in Dhaka in my university called Gobeshona. Gobeshona is a Bangla word for research. So it started off about 8-9 years ago, bringing together the researchers on climate change in Bangladesh across many universities and research institutes. And we started working together and we do a big annual conference, a physical conference here in my university here. And then because of COVID over the last 2 years, we couldn't hold a physical conference. We went online. And because we were online and virtual, we reached out to friends all over the world who are working on locally led adaptation. That's the theme of my research. And we found partners all over the world, from Australia in the east to the United States to Canada to Europe to Africa, Asia. And we offered them a session in the conference. We ended up having so many requests that we ran the conference 24 hours a day for 7 days. So 8 hours for the Asia Pacific time zone, 8 hours for the Africa Europe time zones, 8 hours for the Americas time zones, and then around the world again following the sun. 7 whole days, 100 sessions from all over the world. And it went so well that we did it again this year, and we're going to do it again next year, and we're now going to stay online even though we could have a physical conference again, because it's gone global. And we have global